love, cruelty, and the vengeful spirit of the first wife. Summary. In the dead of night, Clara walks down a desolate path toward a misty cemetery, seeking the truth about Evelyn, her husband William's first wife. Evelyn, a vibrant young woman, had suffered under William's cruelty and died mysteriously. Her spirit, consumed by rage, haunts the mansion, terrorizing its inhabitants. Clara endures eerie disturbances, whispers, shattered mirrors, and chilling cries. Desperate, she uncovers the truth: Evelyn's death was no fever but murder, orchestrated by William to silence her forever. With the help of a medium, Clara confronts the restless spirit. A séance unleashes Evelyn's fury, exposing William's crimes. Her ghost materializes, delivering a chilling promise of vengeance. The next day, William is found dead, his face frozen in terror, with Evelyn's wedding ring by his side. Clara flees the cursed estate, unable to escape the horrors she witnessed. The abandoned mansion stands as a grim monument to Evelyn's tragic fate and unrelenting quest for justice. Her ghost lingers, a warning to all who dare enter. This tale of betrayal, supernatural terror, and haunting revenge reminds us that even in death, the truth cannot be silenced. Part 1. The haunting begins. Clara sat stiffly in the carriage as it creaked to a stop before the grand estate. The sprawling mansion loomed ahead, its silhouette stark against the fading twilight. Its windows glinted like eyes, watching her arrival with an air of knowing. She suppressed a shiver as the wind picked up, rustling the bare branches of ancient oaks that lined the driveway. The footman opened the door, but Clara hesitated. There was something heavy in the air, a strange stillness that unsettled her. Finally, she stepped out, clutching her cloak tightly against the cold. She cast a glance over her shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something watching her. "Welcome, my lady," said a maid, her voice low and her eyes avoiding Clara's. "Master William awaits inside." The house was no warmer. The walls seemed to lean inward, casting shadows that flickered with the dim light of sconces. Clara's boots echoed as she crossed the marble foyer. A faint scent tickled her nose: lavender. It wasn't hers. She paused and sniffed the air. It was fleeting, elusive, and unsettling. William emerged from his study, his smile tight. "Clara, my dear, welcome home." His arms wrapped around her briefly, but his warmth felt like a distant memory. His eyes darted to the corners of the room, as though he feared what might be lurking there. That night, sleep eluded Clara. The heavy drapes in her bedroom muffled all but the faintest whisper of wind. Yet as she lay there, the whispers grew soft at first, then more distinct. A woman's voice, low and sorrowful, floated through the room. "Help me," it begged. Clara bolted upright. The room was empty, save for the faint scent of lavender that seemed stronger now. Trembling, she lit a candle and stepped cautiously into the hallway. Shadows danced along the walls as the flame wavered. The air was thick, oppressive, and she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The next morning, Clara dismissed her fears as the remnants of travel fatigue. She focused on settling in, greeting the servants, and learning the routines of the household. Yet unease lingered. The staff avoided meeting her gaze, their hushed conversations ceasing whenever she entered the room. At dinner, William seemed distracted, his fork scraping aimlessly across his plate. "William," she ventured, "was there someone else in the house last night?" "A guest." Perhaps his fork paused midair. "No," he replied too quickly. "Why do you ask?" "I thought I heard someone," Clara said carefully. "And there was a scent." Lavender. William's face darkened. "You're imagining things. The house is old. It creaks and groans. Pay it no mind," but Clara couldn't ignore it. That night, the whispers returned. This time they seemed closer, more urgent. A soft cry punctuated the silence, and the faint lavender scent became suffocating. Clara's heart pounded as she sat frozen in her bed. When she dared to open her eyes, she saw the faint outline of a woman by the window, her figure blurred like a smudge on glass. Clara screamed, and the apparition vanished. Servants rushed in, their faces pale with terror. William arrived moments later, his expression a mixture of annoyance and something else she couldn't place: fear. "It's nothing," William said curtly, waving the servants away. "Just a nightmare. but Clara knew what she'd seen was real. The house was hiding something, a secret that whispered through its halls and clung to the air like the scent of lavender. The following days only deepened Clara's unease. Each corner of the mansion seemed to harbor its own shadow, its own sound. In the morning, she found herself drawn to the garden, hoping the sunlight would chase away the chill that clung to her even in the brightest hours. But the scent of lavender followed her there too, weaving through the hedges as if carried by unseen hands. One evening, as Clara descended the grand staircase, she paused at a portrait hanging by the landing. The woman depicted was stunningly beautiful, her eyes bright and her expression serene. Clara leaned closer, squinting to make out the nameplate at the bottom, Evelyn. A shiver ran down her spine. She didn't need to ask, this was William's first wife. Later that night, Clara's curiosity overcame her. She sought out Mrs. Danforth, the housekeeper, a stern woman with silver-streaked hair, who had been with the estate for decades. Mrs. Danforth, who was Evelyn? Clara asked. Her voice hushed. The housekeeper's face paled. She was the master's first wife, a kind soul. But it's best not to dwell on the past, madam. What happened to her? Clara pressed. Mrs. Danforth hesitated, her hands twisting the edge of her apron. She passed. It was sudden, tragic. But please, madam, let her rest that night. Clara's dreams were restless. She saw Evelyn, or at least she thought it was her. A figure in white, standing at the edge of the garden, her hair flowing like silk in the wind. She turned, her face pale as moonlight, lips moving soundlessly before she vanished into the darkness. Clara woke drenched in sweat, the faint scent of lavender heavy in the air once more. She knew she couldn't ignore it any longer. Whatever haunted this house would not leave her in peace until its story was uncovered. The more Clara probed, the more the house seemed to react. Doors would creak open on their own, revealing dim, forgotten rooms cloaked in dust and secrets. Once, while exploring the attic, Clara found an old chest filled with letters. Most were innocuous, but one bore Evelyn's name in an elegant script. She hesitated before opening it, the paper brittle beneath her fingers. The letter was unfinished, but its tone was desperate. To whomever may read this, know that I am trapped. He won't let me. Please, help. The letter ended abruptly, a dark blot of ink marking the page. Clara's heart raced as she clutched the fragile paper. Who had Evelyn been writing to? And why hadn't it been sent? That night, the whispers turned into sobs. Clara followed the sound to the library, where the fireplace glowed dimly. She called out, her voice trembling. Evelyn, is that you? The sobbing stopped, replaced by a deep, unnatural silence. Then, faintly, the lavender scent returned, stronger than ever. Clara felt a cold hand brush her shoulder, and she spun around, but no one was there. Tell me what happened to you, she pleaded. Please. Let me help, a faint voice replied, barely audible. Find the truth before it's too late. Part 2. A troubled past. Clara could not shake the unease that had settled over her since she moved into the estate. Every servant's glance seemed to hold a hidden warning. Every silence carried the weight of an unspeakable secret. The air in the mansion felt oppressive, almost alive, and Clara could not escape the feeling that something or someone was watching her. One afternoon, while exploring the east wing, Clara stumbled upon a locked door. The handle was cold beneath her fingers, and she felt a strange pull, as though the room beyond was calling to her. Before she could dwell on it, Mrs. Danforth appeared, her face pale and tense. Madam, this part of the house is rarely used. Mrs. Danforth said hurriedly. Best to leave it be. Why is it locked? Clara asked, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Mrs. Danforth hesitated. Belonged to the late Mrs. Evelyn. The master preferred it sealed after her passing. Clara's curiosity burned brighter. What was she like, Mrs. Danforth? I've seen her portrait. She seemed radiant. The housekeeper's expression darkened, and she wrung her hands. She was indeed, madam, kind and full of life. The house flourished under her presence. But tragedy struck. It was sudden, unexpected. We do not speak of it. That evening, Clara pressed William for answers during dinner. William, I found Evelyn's portrait today, she began cautiously. She was very beautiful. You must have loved her dearly. William's fork clattered against his plate. His face hardened. Evelyn is in the past. There is no need to dredge up old memories, but her death, it must have been difficult for you. I would like to understand. His eyes flickered with something Clara could not name. Anger. Fear? Let it rest, Clara. This is your home now. Clara did not press further, but her mind churned with questions. If Evelyn's death was so tragic, why did no one want to speak of her? And why did the servants look so haunted whenever her name was mentioned? The whispers grew louder that night. Clara's sleep was broken by faint sobs that seemed to echo from the walls themselves. She lit a candle and followed the sound down the hallway, her bare feet brushing against the cold floor. The sobs led her to the locked room. She pressed her ear to the door, her breath hitching as she heard a woman's voice, trembling and full of despair. Why did you leave me? Why won't you help? Clara stepped back, her heart hammering in her chest. The voice sounded so real, so close, but the door remained locked. The scent of lavender wafted through the air, stronger than ever. Clara fled back to her room, her mind racing. The next day, she confronted Mrs. Danforth once more. I need to know about Evelyn. No more evasions. Please. The housekeeper's face crumpled. She deserved better. The master loved her, but his love turned cruel. He controlled her, isolated her. By the end, she was a shadow of the woman she once was. Clara's blood ran cold. And her death, Mrs. Danforth looked away. They say it was illness, but I've always wondered. She was so young, so strong. It doesn't sit right. That evening, Clara returned to the library, determined to find more clues. She sifted through dusty journals and forgotten letters, her fingers trembling as she unearthed fragments of Evelyn's life. One letter, written in delicate script, caught her eye. To my dearest friend, I fear I am trapped in a life that is no longer mine. William's love has become a cage, and I cannot breathe within it. I have tried to endure, but my strength wanes. If you receive this letter, please come. I need your help before it is too late. The letter was unsigned, unfinished. Clara's heart ached for the woman who had written it, for the desperation etched into every word. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her pocket. That night, Clara's dreams were plagued by images of Evelyn. She saw her standing in the garden, her white gown stained with tears, her hands outstretched as though begging for salvation. Clara woke with a start, the scent of lavender lingering in the air. She knew she could not stop now. Evelyn's story demanded to be told. The locked room weighed heavily on Clara's mind. She waited until William left for the town the next morning before approaching it again. This time, she carried a set of keys she had taken from Mrs. Danforth's office. Her hands shook as she tried each one until, at last, the lock clicked open. The room was dark, musty, and filled with the remnants of a life frozen in time. Evelyn's dresses hung limply in the wardrobe, her writing desk covered in a fine layer of dust. Clara's eyes fell on a small journal lying on the desk. She opened it, her heart pounding as she read Evelyn's final entries. I hear them at night, the whispers. They call to me, warning me. I fear I am losing my mind, but I cannot escape this house. William watches my every move. He says it is for my safety. But I feel like a prisoner. If something happens to me, know that I tried to leave, but he wouldn't let me. Tears blurred Clara's vision. She clutched the journal to her chest, a mix of sorrow and anger surging through her. Evelyn had been silenced, her story buried beneath layers of fear and denial. But Clara vowed she would not let it remain hidden. As she left the room, the air seemed heavier, charged with an energy she could not explain. The whispers followed her down the hall, more insistent now, and the scent of lavender grew almost overwhelming. Clara turned, her voice steadied despite the tremor in her hands. Evelyn, she said aloud, I will uncover the truth. I promise. For the first time, the whispers stopped. The house fell into a deep, expectant silence, as though holding its breath. Days passed, and Clara's resolve only deepened. The journal stayed with her, its words replaying in her mind like a haunting melody. She revisited Evelyn's entries, piecing together a portrait of a woman whose joy had been systematically stripped away. The whispers resumed, softer now, almost guiding her as she delved into the mansion's forgotten corners. One rainy afternoon, Clara discovered a hidden compartment in Evelyn's writing desk. Inside was a bundle of letters addressed to William, none of them sent. Clara unfolded one, her breath hitching as she read William. I do not recognize the man you have become. Your love has turned to poison, and I am suffocating under its weight. I have tried to reach you, but you see only what you wish to see. If there is any part of the man I once loved still within you, let me go. Please. The letter trembled in Clara's hands. She could almost hear Evelyn's voice, pleading through the years. The scent of lavender filled the room once more, and Clara felt a chill brush against her cheek, as though someone unseen was standing beside her. I will not let this be in vain, Clara whispered. She tucked the letter into her pocket and rose, her heart pounding with determination. Evelyn's voice, faint and sorrowful, seemed to echo in her mind, find the truth before it's too late. Part 3. Unseen Terror. Clara had always thought herself pragmatic, not prone to flights of fancy or superstition. But the mansion seemed determined to break her resolve. In the days following her discovery of Evelyn's journal, the disturbances escalated into something impossible to ignore. The whispers that had been faint and sorrowful now carried an edge of malice, growing louder and more insistent. At first it was small things, a vase inexplicably knocked over, doors creaking open on their own. Clara brushed these off as accidents. But when she awoke one morning to find her mirror shattered, a jagged crack splitting her reflection in two, a chill of dread settled over her. She knew she was no longer alone. The nights became Clara's greatest torment. It started with the cries. Low, mournful wails that echoed through the halls, growing louder as the hours dragged on. Clara tried to block them out, pulling the blankets over her head, but the sound seeped into her mind, as though the walls themselves were weeping. One night, the cries turned to screams. They pierced through the darkness, waking her in a panic. She lit her candle with trembling hands and stepped into the corridor, her heart pounding. The screams seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere, reverberating through the empty halls. As Clara moved cautiously down the corridor, the air grew colder with every step. She felt a presence behind her, a weight that made her skin crawl. She turned quickly, her candle casting flickering shadows against the walls, but there was nothing there. And yet, the feeling persisted, as though invisible eyes were boring into her. The disturbances were not confined to the nights. During the day, objects began moving on their own. A chair slid across the room as Clara sat in the parlor, its legs screeching against the floor. Books toppled from shelves without warning, pages fluttering as if caught in an unseen breeze. The most unsettling incident occurred in the kitchen, where Clara found a knife embedded in the wooden table, its blade quivering as though it had just been thrown. The servants, already uneasy, became openly terrified. Clara overheard their hushed conversations, snippets of words like cursed and vengeful spirit when she confronted Mrs. Danforth. The housekeeper's usually composed demeanor cracked. This house isn't safe, Madam, Mrs. Danforth admitted, her voice trembling. There are things that cannot be explained. I beg you, leave before it's too late. But Clara couldn't leave. Something bound her to the mansion, an invisible thread pulling her deeper into its secrets. She felt an inexplicable connection to Evelyn, as though the late mistress's anguish was calling out to her, demanding justice. The visions began soon after. At first they came in dreams. Clara saw Evelyn wandering the halls, her once bright eyes clouded with despair. In the garden, Evelyn stood motionless, her white gown billowing in a wind that Clara couldn't feel. Her lips moved soundlessly, but her expression was one of pleading. Clara always woke with the scent of lavender lingering in the air, her heart heavy with sorrow. The visions grew more vivid, spilling into Clara's waking hours. One afternoon, as she sat in the library, she glanced up to see Evelyn's reflection in the glass cabinet door. Evelyn's face was pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow, her hand pressed against the glass as though trying to reach through. When Clara turned, the image was gone, but the feeling of icy fingers brushing against her shoulder remained. Desperate for answers, Clara sought out the locked room once more. Armed with the journal and a newfound determination, she entered, bracing herself for what she might find. The room was as she had left it, filled with the echoes of Evelyn's life. But as Clara stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind her, the sound reverberating through the air like a gunshot. The temperature plummeted, and Clara's breath came in visible puffs. The whispers started again, circling her, overlapping until they became a cacophony. Clara clutched the journal to her chest, her voice shaking as she called out, "Evelyn, I know you're here. Please, tell me what happened to you." For a moment, the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening. Then, a shadow began to form in the corner of the room, coalescing into the shape of a woman. Clara's candle flickered wildly, and she felt rooted to the spot as Evelyn's ghost appeared before her. Evelyn's form was translucent, her features twisted with grief and rage. Her lips parted, but the voice that came out was not her own. It was a deep, guttural sound that sent shivers down Clara's spine. "Help me," the spirit rasped. He won't let me rest." Clara's knees buckled, and she sank to the floor. "Who?" "William," she whispered, the words barely audible. Evelyn's form wavered, her head tilting as though listening for something. Then, with a sudden burst of energy, she surged forward, her hand passing through Clara's chest. Clara gasped, a cold pain radiating through her as images flooded her mind. Evelyn locked in the room, pounding on the door, as William's shadow loomed outside. Evelyn crying in the garden, clutching a bundle of letters. Evelyn lying on the bed, her lifeless eyes staring at the ceiling as the scent of lavender filled the air. The visions ended as abruptly as they had begun, and Clara found herself alone in the room once more. The candle had gone out, leaving her in darkness. She fumbled for the door, her fingers trembling, and stumbled into the hallway, gasping for breath. Clara knew she couldn't stay silent any longer. Evelyn's pain was too great, her story too important. The mansion was a prison, not just for Evelyn's spirit but for the truth. Clara resolved to confront William, no matter the cost. The visions, the cries, and the shattered mirrors were all pieces of a puzzle she was determined to solve. That night, as Clara lay in bed, she heard Evelyn's voice more. This time it was calm, almost soothing. "You mustn't stop," Evelyn whispered. He cannot win." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "I promise I won't," she whispered back, her voice breaking. "I will find a way to set you free." The lavender scent enveloped her, and for the first time in weeks, Clara felt a flicker of hope. Part 4. Secrets Unearthed. Clara woke to find herself drenched in cold sweat, the faint scent of lavender still clinging to the air around her. Evelyn's voice had lingered in her dreams, imploring her to dig deeper, to uncover the truth. The mansion seemed alive now, its every creak and shadow brimming with secrets just beyond her reach. Determined, Clara sought out Mrs. Danforth that morning. The housekeeper, pale and tense, had been avoiding Clara's questions for weeks. But Clara's persistence finally wore her down. The two sat in the dimly lit kitchen, the air heavy with unspoken words. "It's time you tell me what really happened to Evelyn," Clara said, her voice firm but tinged with desperation. "I can't rest until I know the truth." Mrs. Danforth hesitated, her hands trembling as she clutched a handkerchief. "You don't know what you're asking, madam." "The master. He is not a man to cross." "I'm not afraid of him," Clara lied. "Evelyn deserves justice. Whatever happened to her, she deserves to be free." The old woman's eyes filled with tears, and she finally relented. "Very well, madam," she whispered, her voice quivering. "But you must promise to leave this place once you know." Mrs. Danforth's account unraveled like a nightmare. Evelyn, she revealed, had once been the heart of the mansion. Her laughter had filled its halls, her kindness endearing her to every servant. But William's love for her had been suffocating, obsessive. He controlled every aspect of her life, forbidding her from seeing friends or leaving the estate. When Evelyn tried to defy him, William's temper turned violent. "It started with words," Mrs. Danforth said, her voice hollow. "But words turned to threats, and threats turned to actions. He locked her away, madam. Locked her in that room during the harshest winter we've seen in years." Clara's breath caught in her throat. "Why?" She wanted to leave him, Mrs. Danforth said, tears streaming down her face. She had written letters, planned her escape. But he found out. He said she was his, and that she'd die before he let her go. Clara felt a cold fury building inside her. He left her there to die, Mrs. Danforth nodded, her voice breaking. We servants were forbidden to intervene. He told us she was ill, that she needed isolation to recover. But we all knew. We heard her cries, her pleas for mercy. And then, silence. The revelation hit Clara like a tidal wave. She staggered back to her room, Evelyn's journal clutched tightly to her chest. The mansion seemed to shift around her, the air heavier, the shadows deeper. It was as if the house itself mourned Evelyn's fate. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. Evelyn's story replayed in her mind, her anguish seeping into Clara's dreams. The visions returned, more vivid than ever. Clara saw Evelyn pounding on the locked door, her fingers bloody from scratching at the wood. She saw William standing outside, his face cold and unfeeling. But the most haunting vision was of Evelyn's final moments. She lay curled on the frozen floor, her breath shallow, her tears freezing on her cheeks. The scent of lavender filled the room as her spirit left her body, her sorrow and rage binding her to the mansion forever. The next morning, Clara confronted William. He sat in the study, his expression smug and indifferent as she entered. But his confidence wavered when he saw the fire in her eyes. You killed her, Clara said, her voice shaking with rage. You left Evelyn to die in that room, alone and terrified. William's jaw tightened. You don't know what you're talking about. She was ill. I did what I thought was best. Don't lie to me, Clara shouted, slamming Evelyn's journal onto the desk. I've seen her suffering, William. I've felt it. She won't rest until the truth is known. For a moment, William's mask of composure slipped, revealing the guilt and fear beneath. But he quickly recovered, his tone turning icy. This is my house, Clara. You'd do well to remember that. Clara glared at him, her resolve unshaken. This isn't over. Evelyn will have her justice. The disturbances grew even more violent after that confrontation. Mirrors shattered without warning, paintings fell from the walls, and the whispers became screams. Evelyn's presence was no longer subtle, it was a force of nature, her rage shaking the very foundations of the mansion. One night, Clara was awoken by the sound of heavy footsteps outside her door. She opened it cautiously, only to see a trail of frost leading down the hallway. Following it, she was led to the locked room. The door was ajar, and the scent of lavender was overpowering. Inside, Evelyn's ghost waited. Her translucent figure was both beautiful and terrifying, her eyes glowing with a mixture of sorrow and fury. You must end this, Evelyn said, her voice echoing as if from a great distance. He cannot escape what he's done, Clara nodded, tears streaming down her face. I'll make him pay. I swear it. Evelyn's form began to fade, but her voice lingered. Thank you, she whispered, for remembering me. The next morning, Clara devised a plan. She knew she couldn't bring Evelyn back, but she could ensure that William faced the consequences of his actions. She gathered Evelyn's letters and journal, the damning evidence that painted a clear picture of his cruelty. Clara sent them to the authorities, her heart pounding as she sealed the envelope. The mansion seemed to hold its breath as she waited for the fallout. William grew increasingly paranoid, his once dominating presence reduced to a shadow of its former self. And when the authorities finally arrived, he didn't resist. He knew his sins had finally caught up with him. As William was led away in handcuffs, Clara stood in the garden, the scent of lavender wrapping around her like a gentle embrace. The mansion felt lighter, the oppressive weight that had hung over it lifted. For the first time, Clara felt at peace. Evelyn's story had been told, her tormentor brought to justice. And though the scars of the past would never fully heal, Clara knew that Evelyn's spirit could finally rest. Part 5. The Medium's Warning. Desperation had become Clara's constant companion. The haunting presence of Evelyn's spirit, the oppressive air of the mansion, and the weight of William's cruelty bore down on her with relentless force. Clara knew she could not face this alone. It was Mrs. Danforth who finally suggested seeking out Madame Agnes, a renowned medium known for her uncanny ability to commune with spirits. If anyone can help, it's her, Mrs. Danforth said, her voice trembling. But be warned, madam. The things she reveals may haunt you forever. Clara wasted no time. That very afternoon she sent for Madame Agnes, her hope clinging to the faint promise of clarity. Madame Agnes arrived 2 days later, her presence as imposing as her reputation. She was a tall, thin woman with piercing gray eyes that seemed to see through the soul. Draped in dark, flowing garments, she carried an air of authority that silenced even the most skeptical. "This house is heavy with sorrow," Agnes said upon stepping into the foyer. Her voice was low and melodic, yet it sent a shiver down Clara's spine. "The spirit here is not at peace. She demands justice." Clara led Agnes to the parlor, where a fire burned weakly in the hearth. "It's Evelyn," Clara said, her voice cracking. She's trapped. I need to help her." Agnes regarded Clara with a mix of pity and determination. Spirits like hers are not easily appeased. Her rage binds her here, her sorrow fuels her unrest. If you wish to aid her, you must be prepared to face the truth, all of it. The séance was set for that evening. The servants were instructed to stay clear of the parlor, and the curtains were drawn tight to keep the room cloaked in shadow. Agnes arranged a circle of candles around the table, their flickering flames casting eerie shapes on the walls. Clara sat across from the medium, her hands trembling as she placed them on the table. Agnes closed her eyes and began to hum softly, her voice resonating with an otherworldly timbre. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and Clara's breath became visible in the chill. "Evelyn," Agnes called, her voice firm. "We seek you. Speak to us. Tell us what you need." The flames flickered violently, and a gust of icy wind swept through the room. Clara's heart raced as a faint voice echoed from the shadows. "Help me, we are here," Agnes said, her eyes still closed. "Tell us your pain. Show us your truth." Suddenly the table shook, and Clara felt an invisible force press against her chest. Images flooded her mind. Evelyn locked in her room, pounding on the door as William's voice rang out, cold and unyielding. The vision shifted to Evelyn's lifeless body lying on the frozen floor, her eyes wide with terror and sorrow. "He took everything from me," Evelyn's voice wailed, her anguish palpable. "He must pay for what he has done." Agnes's eyes snapped open, glowing faintly in the candlelight. "She is consumed by her pain," she said, her voice trembling. "Her rage is like a storm, unending and fierce. She cannot rest until the man who wronged her is held accountable." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "I will make him pay," she vowed. "I promise, Evelyn. You will have justice." The séance ended abruptly as the candles extinguished themselves, plunging the room into darkness. Agnes lit a single match, her face illuminated in its faint glow. "You must be careful," she warned Clara. "Spirits like Evelyn's are powerful. They are driven by raw emotion, and that makes them unpredictable. If you fail to fulfill your promise, her wrath may turn on you." Clara nodded, her resolve unwavering. "I won't fail her." Madame Agnes placed a hand on Clara's shoulder, her grip firm. "Then be prepared for what lies ahead. This will not end easily, but it must end." The days following the séance were marked by an eerie calm, as though Evelyn's spirit was waiting, watching. Clara threw herself into her mission, combing through every letter, journal, and artifact she could find. Each piece of evidence painted a clearer picture of William's cruelty and Evelyn's suffering. Madame Agnes's words echoed in her mind. "Spirits cannot lie, but they often speak in riddles. Listen closely to what Evelyn tells you. The key to freeing her may already be in your hands." Clara's search led her to a locked chest in the attic, its surface covered in a thick layer of dust. She pried it open to reveal a bundle of letters written by Evelyn in her final days. The words were desperate, filled with longing and fear. "To anyone who finds this, please know that I tried to escape. William's love has turned to madness, and I am a prisoner in my own home. If I do not survive, tell the world what he has done. Do not let him bury me in silence." Clara's hands shook as she read. Evelyn's words were a plea not just for freedom, but for justice. Clara knew she had to act quickly. That night, Evelyn appeared to Clara once more. Her figure was faint, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and sorrow. "You found them," Evelyn said, her voice soft but insistent. "Now use them. Make him pay, I will," Clara promised. "Your story won't be forgotten." As Evelyn faded into the shadows, the scent of lavender lingered, wrapping around Clara like a final embrace. She knew the path ahead would be treacherous, but she was ready to face it. For Evelyn, and for the justice she deserved. Madame Agnes departed the next morning, her parting words echoing in Clara's mind. "Your strength will be tested. Do not falter, for this spirit has chosen you to be her voice. And remember, justice is the only way to peace." Clara spent hours each day piecing together Evelyn's life. She read every note, studied every artifact. She discovered hidden journals where Evelyn chronicled the torment she endured under William's control. One entry stood out tonight. "He locked me in again. He said it's for my own good. But I can see the hatred in his eyes. I've tried to plead, to reason with him, but he no longer listens. I fear for my life. If I die here, please, someone tell the world my story. Let them know I fought." The words filled Clara with resolve. She began compiling the evidence, determined to confront William with the undeniable truth of his cruelty. As she worked, she felt Evelyn's presence nearby, guiding her. It was no longer fear that gripped her, it was purpose. One night, as Clara finalized her plan, Evelyn's voice came to her, softer than ever before. "Thank you," the spirit whispered, "for seeing me, for believing me." Tears streamed down Clara's face. "I will not fail you," she replied. "Your story will not end in silence." The mansion seemed to breathe easier that night, the oppressive weight lifting ever so slightly. Evelyn's justice was coming, and Clara was determined to see it through to the end. Part 6. The Séance. The night of the séance was shrouded in an almost unnatural stillness. The mansion, which usually creaked and groaned under the weight of its history, seemed to hold its breath. Clara sat at the edge of her bed, staring at the clock on her bedside table. The hands moved slowly, dragging her closer to the hour of confrontation. Downstairs, Madame Agnes prepared the parlor for what Clara knew would be a harrowing ordeal. The medium had instructed the servants to leave the house entirely for the night, insisting that the séance required complete isolation. Only Clara, Agnes, and the echoes of Evelyn's restless spirit would remain. The parlor was transformed into a sanctuary of shadows and flickering candlelight. A large, round table stood at the center, surrounded by high-backed chairs. A circle of white chalk encased the space, marked with symbols that Clara did not understand but found unsettling. Madame Agnes stood at the head of the table, her hands moving with precision as she placed objects of crystal, a bell, and a mirror at strategic points within the circle. "Sit," Agnes instructed. Her voice carried the weight of authority, leaving no room for hesitation. Clara obeyed, her hands trembling as she took her place at the table. Agnes joined her, folding her hands and closing her eyes. For a moment, the room was silent, save for the faint crackle of the fire. "Evelyn," Agnes began, her voice low and steady. "We call upon you. We seek your presence. Speak to us, and reveal what binds you here." The candles flickered wildly, their flames stretching and bending as if caught in an unseen wind. The temperature in the room plummeted, and Clara shivered, her breath visible in the icy air. A faint whisper drifted through the room, soft and indistinct. "Did you hear that?" Clara whispered, her voice tight with fear. "Focus," Agnes said sharply. "She is near." "Evelyn, we are here to listen. Show us your truth." The whisper grew louder, transforming into a low, mournful wail. The table began to shake, and Clara gripped its edges, her knuckles white. A sudden gust of wind extinguished the fire in the hearth, plunging the room into near darkness. The only light came from the candles, which now burned with an unnatural blue hue. "She's here," Agnes murmured. Her eyes remained closed, but her expression was tense. "Clara, do not break the circle, no matter what happens." Clara nodded, though her heart pounded so violently she thought it might burst. The wail intensified, becoming a scream so piercing that Clara covered her ears. A shadow began to take shape in the center of the room, swirling and twisting as if struggling to manifest. Slowly, the figure of a woman emerged. Evelyn. Her translucent form was both beautiful and horrifying, her face etched with anguish and fury. "Evelyn," Agnes said firmly, "we are here to help you." Speak your truth. Evelyn's eyes, glowing with an eerie light, fixed on Clara. Her voice, when it came, was like the wind through a graveyard, cold and hollow. He took everything from me, she said, her tone trembling with rage. He locked me away. He let me die alone. Clara felt tears streaming down her face. Evelyn, I know, she said, her voice breaking. I've seen what he did to you. I'm here to make it right. Evelyn's gaze softened momentarily, but her form flickered as if struggling to maintain its shape. The room erupted into chaos. The mirror on the table shattered, shards flying outward but stopping at the edge of the circle, as if hitting an invisible barrier. The bell rang violently, its sound sharp and discordant. Books flew from the shelves, pages ripping as they scattered across the room. Agnes raised her voice above the cacophony. Evelyn, what must be done to free you? Tell us. Evelyn's form grew more solid, her presence filling the room with an almost unbearable pressure. He must pay, she said, her voice rising. He must suffer as I suffered. Clara nodded, her resolve hardening. I will make him answer for what he's done. I swear it. Evelyn's expression shifted, a flicker of hope breaking through her anguish. Promise me, she whispered, her voice faint now. Promise me justice. I promise, Clara said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. I won't stop until you're free. As quickly as it had begun, the chaos ceased. The room fell silent, the air heavy with the scent of lavender. Evelyn's form faded, leaving only a lingering glow where she had stood. The candles returned to their normal flame, and the temperature began to rise. Agnes slumped back in her chair, her face pale and drenched in sweat. She is powerful, the medium said, her voice weak, and her rage is justified. But Clara, you must be careful. Spirits like hers are not easily satisfied. If you fail her, her wrath may consume you. Clara nodded, her heart still racing. I won't fail her, she said, her voice firm. I can't. That night, Clara sat alone in her room, replaying the séance in her mind. Evelyn's final words echoed in her ears. He must pay. He must suffer as I suffered. The evidence Clara had gathered felt heavy in her hands. Letters, journal entries, even photographs, each one a testament to William's cruelty. She knew what she had to do. Justice was no longer just a promise, it was a mission. The mansion, though still and quiet, seemed to pulse with a new energy. Clara felt Evelyn's presence everywhere, in the shadows, in the faint scent of lavender that followed her, in the whispers that now carried a note of gratitude rather than anguish. For the first time, Clara did not feel fear. She felt purpose. Evelyn's story would not end in silence, and William would finally face the consequences of his sins. The séance had not just revealed the truth, it had ignited a fire within Clara, and she was ready to burn the lies to the ground. Part 7. A grim fate. The morning sunlight pierced through the heavy curtains, casting fractured patterns across the mansion's grand halls. The air felt stagnant, a foreboding stillness that seemed to settle into Clara's chest the moment she awoke. The faint sound of hurried footsteps and whispers outside her door drew her out of bed, her heart racing. Something was wrong. By the time Clara descended the staircase, a cluster of servants had gathered near the study. Their faces, pale with fear, turned to her as she approached. Mrs. Danforth, her usual stoicism replaced by a trembling urgency, stepped forward. Madam, she began, her voice barely audible. It's the master. He's gone. Clara felt her stomach twist. What do you mean? Gone, she demanded, her voice sharper than she intended. Mrs. Danforth hesitated, glancing toward the study door. He was found in his chair this morning. He's dead. The words hit Clara like a physical blow. Pushing past the servants, she entered the study, her breath catching as she took in the scene. William sat slumped in his chair, his head tilted unnaturally to the side. His lifeless eyes stared ahead, frozen wide in an expression of unspeakable terror. His mouth hung open, as though caught mid-scream. The color had drained from his face, leaving his skin ashen and waxy. But it was the item on the desk that held Clara's attention, Evelyn's wedding ring. Its delicate band seemed to shimmer faintly in the morning light, an unmistakable symbol of her enduring presence. The room smelled faintly of lavender, stronger than Clara had ever experienced, wrapping around her like a suffocating embrace. Clara approached cautiously, her legs trembling beneath her. The whispers began, faint at first but growing in intensity. She recognized Evelyn's voice among them, soft and mournful, weaving through the air like a lament. He paid. Evelyn's voice echoed, her tone heavy with sorrow. He suffered, as I suffered. But the pain remains. Clara reached out, her fingers trembling as they hovered over the ring. The metal was icy cold as she lifted it from the desk. Tears streamed down her face as she clutched it tightly, her chest tightening with a mix of grief and relief. "I'm so sorry, Evelyn," Clara whispered. "I wanted to save you. I wanted to give you peace." The oppressive air in the room seemed to lift slightly, and the scent of lavender faded. For the first time, Clara felt Evelyn's presence recede, as though the spirit was no longer bound to the mansion. Yet there was a lingering sadness, a weight that refused to fully disappear. The authorities were summoned, and by midday the house was teeming with investigators. They examined William's body and the study with a mixture of confusion and unease. The official ruling was a heart attack, though Clara could see the doubt in the officers' eyes. The servants whispered among themselves, their fear palpable, but Clara remained silent. She had no intention of revealing what she knew. By evening, the house was eerily quiet. Clara sat alone in the parlor, Evelyn's ring resting in her palm. The events of the day replayed in her mind, each detail more surreal than the last. William was gone, but the mansion still felt heavy with its dark history. Clara turned the ring over in her hand, tracing its delicate engravings. She thought of everything Evelyn had endured, the strength it must have taken to defy William, even in death. Clara vowed to ensure that Evelyn's story would not fade into obscurity. That night, Clara dreamed of Evelyn. She stood in the garden, bathed in soft moonlight, her white gown fluttering gently in the breeze. Evelyn's face was serene, her eyes no longer clouded with despair. She raised her hand in a silent gesture of gratitude before fading into the mist. Clara woke with a renewed sense of purpose. William's death had closed one chapter, but there was more to be done. The mansion still carried the echoes of its tragic past, and Clara felt compelled to bring those echoes into the light. She began writing the next morning, pouring Evelyn's story onto the pages with meticulous care. Every letter, every journal entry, every fragment of Evelyn's life was laid bare. Clara spared no detail of the cruelty and betrayal that had unfolded within the mansion's walls. The manuscript became her mission, her way of ensuring that Evelyn's voice would finally be heard. Weeks turned into months, and the mansion began to change. The oppressive atmosphere that had once permeated every corner seemed to dissipate. The servants, though still cautious, moved about with greater ease. The whispers and shadows that had haunted Clara's nights faded, replaced by a quiet stillness. The manuscript was published under a pseudonym, its title simple yet evocative, A Widow's Lament. It garnered widespread acclaim for its haunting prose and vivid portrayal of loss and resilience. Though Clara never revealed the truth behind the story, she took solace in knowing that Evelyn's legacy had been preserved. Years later, Clara stood in the garden, now overgrown with wildflowers. She held Evelyn's ring in her hand, its once polished surface dulled by time. She placed it gently on the edge of the fountain, where the sunlight caught its edges, making it glimmer one last time. "Rest now, Evelyn," Clara said softly. "You're free." The wind swept through the garden, carrying the faintest hint of lavender. It felt like a final goodbye, a fleeting reminder of the woman whose strength had endured beyond death. Clara turned and walked back toward the house, leaving the ring behind. For the first time, the mansion felt like a home, no longer a prison of memories, but a place where the past had been laid to rest. Part 8. The Escape. The mansion had always been oppressive, but after William's death it became unbearable. Clara had hoped that his demise would bring peace, not just to Evelyn's spirit but to herself as well. Instead, the mansion seemed to pulsate with an energy that grew darker with each passing day. It whispered to her in the dead of night, calling her name in tones that sent shivers down her spine. Clara couldn't ignore the signs. The air was thick with memories of suffering, and every room felt as though it held secrets waiting to pounce. She found herself avoiding mirrors, knowing they might show her more than her reflection. Doors creaked open on their own, revealing nothing but empty hallways that seemed longer than they had the day before. The scent of lavender no longer brought solace, it choked her, clinging to her skin and hair. One night, Clara woke to the sound of footsteps echoing in her bedroom. Her heart raced as she sat up, clutching the blankets tightly. The room was dark, save for the pale light of the moon streaming through the window. The sound stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was deafening. "Who's there?" Clara whispered, her voice trembling. No answer. Only the faint rustle of the curtains moving in an unfelt breeze. She stared into the darkness, her breath shallow, until she felt the unmistakable sensation of a cold hand brushing against her cheek. Clara screamed, scrambling out of bed and lighting the nearest candle. The room was empty, but she knew she wasn't alone. The next morning, Clara made her decision. She couldn't stay. The house had consumed too much of her already, and she feared it would take the rest if she didn't leave. She packed only the essentials, leaving behind the possessions that had once seemed so important. The ring, Evelyn's ring, she placed carefully in a small box and slipped into her bag. She couldn't leave that behind. It was a reminder of everything that had happened, of the promise she had made. Mrs. Danforth tried to dissuade her. "Madam, you can't leave. This is your home now." Clara shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "This house was never mine, Mrs. Danforth. It belongs to Evelyn. It always has. And now it belongs to its ghosts." The housekeeper's face crumpled, but she didn't argue further. Perhaps she understood. Perhaps she, too, had felt the weight of the mansion's gaze, its silent demands. Clara's departure was swift. She hired a carriage to take her to the nearest town, her heart heavy as she watched the mansion grow smaller in the distance. For a moment she thought she saw a figure standing in the upstairs window, watching her leave. It could have been a trick of the light, but Clara knew better. The journey was quiet, but Clara's mind was loud with memories. She thought of Evelyn, her laughter that once filled the halls, and the screams that replaced it. She thought of William, his cruelty, and the terror etched into his face in death. She thought of the promises she had made, the justice she had sought. She had done what she could, but it wasn't enough to free herself from the shadows that clung to her. Life in the town was simple, a stark contrast to the grandeur and horrors of the mansion. Clara rented a modest cottage on the outskirts, surrounded by trees and the sound of birdsong. She tried to immerse herself in the quiet rhythms of daily life, but the mansion haunted her still. She dreamed of Evelyn often. In her dreams, Evelyn wasn't the tormented figure she had come to know, but the vibrant woman from her portraits. They walked together in the garden, laughing, Evelyn's gown trailing behind her like a ghost of its own. But always, the dream ended the same way. Evelyn would stop, her laughter fading, and she would turn to Clara with eyes full of sorrow. "Why did you leave?" Evelyn would ask, her voice echoing. "You promised." Clara would wake with tears streaming down her face, the scent of lavender lingering in the air. It was a reminder that no matter how far she ran, the mansion and its memories were a part of her now. Months passed, and Clara tried to move on. She took up gardening, finding solace in the act of nurturing life. She wrote letters to old friends, though she never spoke of the mansion. The manuscript she had written, A Widow's Lament, became a modest success, its pages a catharsis for her grief. But even as readers praised her haunting prose, Clara felt hollow. She had left the story unfinished, much like her time at the mansion. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Clara found herself holding Evelyn's ring. She turned it over in her hands, tracing its delicate engravings. It felt heavier than she remembered, as though it carried the weight of all she had left behind. "I'm sorry, Evelyn," Clara whispered. "I tried. I really did." The wind outside picked up, rustling the leaves. For a moment, it sounded like a sigh. Clara closed her eyes, clutching the ring tightly. She didn't know if Evelyn had found peace, but she hoped. Clara never returned to the mansion. It remained as she had left it, standing alone on its hill, a monument to its own dark history. The townsfolk spoke of it in hushed tones, their stories growing wilder with each retelling. Some said it was cursed. that the new owners would never last. Others claimed to see lights in the windows at night, shadows moving where no one should be. But Clara didn't need their stories. She carried the truth with her, etched into her heart like a scar. The mansion had been a place of pain, of betrayal, of restless spirits seeking justice. And though she had escaped its walls, she would never truly be free. In her quiet cottage, Clara lived out her days with a mixture of peace and sorrow. She planted lavender in her garden, a small tribute to the woman who had changed her life. And every night, as she lay in bed, she prayed that Evelyn had found the rest she deserved. The memories never left her. They lingered in the corners of her mind, whispering in the dark, reminding her of promises made and broken. But Clara learned to live with them, to let them shape her without consuming her. The mansion might have let her go, but it would always remain with her a shadow, a story, a haunting reminder of the strength it took to walk away. Part 9. The mansion's legacy. Years passed, but the mansion remained on the hill, untouched by time yet shrouded in a veil of decay. The grand estate, once a beacon of opulence and power, stood abandoned, its windows dark and hollow like the eyes of a forgotten specter. The townsfolk, who had once whispered about its grandeur, now spoke of it in hushed tones, their voices laced with fear and superstition. The story of Evelyn and William became legend, passed down in fragmented tales that grew more chilling with each retelling. Children dared one another to venture near the mansion's gates, their bravery faltering at the faintest rustle of leaves or the whisper of the wind. Adults avoided the hill altogether, swearing that shadows moved behind the curtains of the empty house, and that the scent of lavender wafted through the air on moonlit nights. For those who ventured too close, the mansion offered no welcome. Travelers who sought shelter within its walls reported strange occurrences, doors slamming shut of their own accord, faint cries echoing in the halls, and the chilling sensation of being watched. Some claimed to see a woman in white drifting through the garden, her figure illuminated by the pale glow of the moon. Others spoke of William's twisted visage appearing in mirrors, his lifeless eyes filled with terror. The mansion's reputation grew, and with it, the sense of dread that surrounded it. Local historians delved into its past, uncovering records of William's rise to power and the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls. Clara's manuscript, A Widow's Lament, became a cornerstone of these investigations, its haunting prose shedding light on the cruelty and suffering that had defined Evelyn's life. But the mansion's influence was not confined to its physical presence. It seeped into the collective consciousness of the town, shaping its stories and its fears. Farmers reported crop failures on the hill's outskirts, attributing them to the mansion's curse. Fishermen claimed that the streams running near the estate were tainted, their waters yielding no catch. Even the birds avoided the mansion, their songs falling silent as they approached its shadow. Despite its grim reputation, the mansion drew the attention of thrill seekers and paranormal investigators. Teams armed with cameras and recording equipment ventured inside, eager to capture evidence of the supernatural. Some emerged shaken, their footage filled with inexplicable phenomena, flickering lights, disembodied whispers, and shadowy figures that defied explanation. Others disappeared altogether, their fates becoming yet another chapter in the mansion's dark lore. For Clara, the mansion's legacy was a weight she carried every day. Though she had fled its walls, she could never escape its shadow. The memories of Evelyn's sorrow and William's cruelty haunted her, shaping her understanding of love, loss, and justice. She continued to write, her works tinged with the themes of betrayal and resilience that had defined Evelyn's story. Clara's modest cottage became a haven for those seeking solace, her garden blooming with lavender as a quiet tribute to the woman who had changed her life. Visitors often remarked on the sense of peace they felt in Clara's presence, unaware of the darkness she had endured to find that peace. One evening, many years after leaving the mansion, Clara received a letter from a young historian named Samuel Greaves. He had read A Widow's Lament and was captivated by its depiction of Evelyn's strength and William's downfall. Samuel sought Clara's guidance, hoping to document the mansion's history in greater detail. Clara hesitated. The thought of revisiting the mansion even through conversation filled her with unease, but she recognized the importance of preserving the truth. She invited Samuel to her home, where she shared her story over cups of tea and the faint scent of lavender drifting through the room. It's not just a house, Clara told him, her voice steady but tinged with sadness. It's a monument to pain, to injustice. But it's also a testament to resilience. Evelyn's spirit, her strength. It's what kept me going. Samuel listened intently, his notebook filling with her words. By the time he left, he carried with him not just the details of the mansion's history, but the weight of its legacy. The mansion story continued to evolve, its legend growing long after Clara's passing. Her manuscript, combined with the accounts of those brave enough to enter the estate, became a chilling reminder of the consequences of cruelty and betrayal. But it also served as a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest places, justice could prevail. The mansion itself remained, a sentinel on the hill, its windows watching over the town like silent witnesses. Some nights, the faint glow of candlelight could be seen flickering within, accompanied by the soft strains of a woman's laughter or the mournful cries of the past. Those who dared to listen closely swore they could hear Evelyn's voice, her final words, a promise that echoed through the halls, "Remember me," and they did. Evelyn's story became immortal, a part of the town's fabric, ensuring that her suffering and her triumph would never be forgotten. The mansion's legacy extended beyond whispers and sightings. It became a symbol of reckoning, a reminder of the darkness hidden within humanity's most polished facades. Artists painted haunting renditions of the estate, its once pristine walls now cloaked in vines and shadows. Writers wove tales inspired by Evelyn's plight, blending fiction with the eerie truths passed down through generations. A decade after Clara's passing, a group of preservationists approached the town with a bold proposal to restore the mansion and turn it into a museum chronicling its infamous history. The townsfolk were divided. Some saw it as an opportunity to confront the past, while others feared awakening whatever spirits still lingered. The restoration began cautiously. Workers reported strange phenomena almost immediately. Tools disappeared. Footsteps echoed in empty halls, and a constant chill pervaded the air. One worker claimed to have seen a woman in white standing in what had once been Evelyn's bedroom, her gaze filled with a sadness so profound it left him shaken for days. Despite the challenges, the project continued. When the museum finally opened, visitors flocked to the mansion, drawn by curiosity and the promise of experiencing the supernatural. The exhibits included artifacts from the estate, excerpts from a widow's lament, and chilling accounts of those who had encountered Evelyn's spirit. The mansion story, once whispered in fear, was now shared openly, ensuring that Evelyn's voice echoed far beyond the town. Evelyn's presence never fully faded. Visitors reported feeling an unshakable sorrow in certain rooms, as though the walls themselves mourned. The scent of lavender lingered in the air, particularly near the exhibit dedicated to Evelyn's life. Guides often found candles extinguished without explanation, their flames snuffed out by unseen hands. One night, a visitor claimed to hear soft singing coming from the garden. She followed the sound, her heart pounding, until she saw a figure standing among the overgrown flowers. The woman turned, her face pale and luminous in the moonlight. Though the visitor fled in terror, she later described the encounter as bittersweet. It wasn't evil, she said, it was longing. The mansion's legend continued to grow, but at its heart remained Evelyn's story, a tale of love turned to obsession, of betrayal met with justice, and of a spirit that refused to be silenced. It was a story that resonated with all who heard it, a reminder that even in the darkest shadows, the truth would find its way into the light.